Jennifer Monson just completed the Bird Brain project, Ducks and Geese, that had a wonderful 4 or 5 days here in the Twin Cities. In fact, 2 weeks ago today, or about 2 weeks ago, a little over 2 weeks ago, we were right here in the Sculpture Garden, and you and the company were performing both with children as well as a performance of the work for adults. And followed by a conversation, as most of the public performances were, with a landscape architect, an ornithologist, other interesting folks here, a public artist in the Twin Cities. Tell me, let's go back a few years, when you first started thinking about doing the first of the Bird Brain projects. What was it that sparked? Was there a key moment that you can remember that made you think, I would like to try to follow the migration of a part of wildlife with dancers, and do something different than what I'd been doing of creating dance works for indoor settings on a stage? What was it that sparked that notion to follow the migration of, in that instance, it was gray whales, right?
Yeah. There were so many things now when I look back that pointed me towards this project. I had been living in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where they fly a lot of pigeons on the rooftops, and that got me thinking about homing pigeons and carrier pigeons and the bird's sense of navigation and how do they do that. I was also just starting a long-distance relationship with someone here in Minneapolis, actually, so I was becoming familiar with email and sort of instant communication, and thinking about years ago when you sent your love letter on the pigeon and it had to flap its wings, and the physical endurance of the pigeons, and the length of time the communication takes and what it does to space and time, the sort of temporal and spatial components of that, versus the instantaneity of email where you get a note in a second. So I was just thinking about how communication networks are changing our relationship to space and time and community. And then I was hanging out on the East River. There's an abandoned industrial site, and I was taking my dog there to walk and seeing migrating birds, mostly waterfowl, ruddy ducks and buffleheads and American black ducks and Canadian geese and Brandt's geese. And that sparked this interest in this natural phenomenon as the river was kind of tearing away the piers, and there was an abandoned fire hydrant, and there was this natural wetlands was produced, and it became home and habitat for birds as they passed through, and I began to see this part of the city as a really important component of a natural system. And I think that up to that point I sort of thought as the city as other than nature.
Right.
And so that was really a revelatory and transformative idea for me. I think that up to that point I was
that a city wasn't separate from nature, but it was part of nature.
Yeah, and it was really dynamic and constantly shifting. And what's more dynamic than a city?
Right.
And what's more dynamic than natural systems? There's all these correlations between them. And I think up to that point I thought, okay, there's nature and we're destroying it, and it's going to be gone in 100 years, and then what do we do?
Right.
And it sort of gave me this hopefulness to see the interrelatedness, and that they could be intertwined and interrelated, and there was all this information to learn from each one. And that, I would say, has led me to the point where I am now in this project, where I'm really thinking about sustainability and what that concept means.
Sustainability on a macro level?
Yeah. I mean, for me as a dancer, I'm 43 years old, I have arthritis and degenerative disc disease, and how do I keep dancing under those circumstances? And I really want to, and I believe I can.
Right.
And
so sustainability for you personally as an artist, but also the sustainability of the planet?
Yes, so it goes from that personal level of my actual physical body to the global and universal kind of concepts of as we extend our reach out into space.
But back for a second to your first idea of creating the Bird Brain project, where you followed the gray whales and then later the osprey, and the notion of doing a 4-part series of migratory dance projects. What was it why didn't you decide, well, I'm interested in gray whales, I think I'll research them and find out what they do, but then just make a piece for the stage, rather than actually taking a group of dancers and following the migration of that species itself? Was it a personal interest that you just wow, it'd be great to just follow it and see where all the places they go? Or was it the notion of putting dance someplace different than where we usually see it? Or was it a combination of the two?
I think it was a combination of the two, and I think my work is very investigative and process-based. And I was really interested in what the experience is of migrating, and I didn't feel like I could do it without actually experiencing it. So the whole project is integrated in terms of the fact that we're traveling the same distances, we're figuring out how to live within those same systems, and I wanted to get us as close as we could to natural systems, like when the sun rises and the sun sets, and when the tide comes in and when it comes out, and how the weather affects us. And it's kind of an idealistic
notion,
yeah. It doesn't really, we can't.
You're on planes or in cars.
Yeah, we're in cars,
right.
and going to a supermarket, but thinking about it on those terms was really interesting to me, and it really reframed how I look at supermarkets and the way that I live, and what it means to be in a group. Like, I think that was the kind of most surprising thing that I learned about the kind of group dynamics and the all the different parts of it and how they weigh on each other. The camping and the buying the food and the figuring out the route and the scheduling private time and personal space and group time and the rehearsal time and the creative.
You see parallels with a group of animals. I mean, obviously it's a much more basic level and instinctual and things, but that sense of having to make it work as a collective in some way.
Yes, and I think as we were talking about the other day, I feel like I've finally come out of this third one with this realization that I am trying to implement some pretty idealistic goals about collectivity and political and philosophical ideas about how I would wish the world could work. And that has been a really complex experience, and all these issues around freedom and power and structure and creativity and I'm actually really excited that I'm left from this one with all these questions about that. I think some of the other ones I was left with the sense that they hadn't worked. That sense of like, oh, it's so difficult, but now I feel like I have more tools to figure out how to make it work, or articulate actually what those goals are.
And why was the experience of Ducks and Geese, and maybe we should talk about this for a second. Tell us where the project started and how long you were on tour, and maybe how many different kinds of communities, or the numbers of different places you stopped and performed in and things.
The Ducks and Geese migration started on March 9th. It was significantly different than the gray whale and osprey migration because we had so much support from our arts partners. And so we spent more time in each city and had more integrated partnerships with environmental and science and schools and all these different organizations, which was really great.
Was that I know that generally you felt that was a tremendous benefit to the project, but did you miss some of the sort of self-contained kind of, do it on our own, not have to like work with the normal structures of arts organizations and all that you had in the first two? Because you guys kind of did it all. You self-produced and kind of just made it happen on your own, and with national parks and environmental partners that you yourself got in touch with. Was there a cost benefit to that is worth analyzing, the difference between this one and the other two?
I think in general this one was much more successful, but based on information that I garnered from the other two. One thing that I did miss was, because some of my partner organizations helped organize panels and stuff, I didn't have as much a personal relationship with as many people. And we were working with more people, so I couldn't have. Would have been impossible. And that's what really feeds me, is that personal relationship with the scientists and the information that I get. And I think also because we didn't choose a particular species this time. So I would have these pretty in-depth conversations about the natural history of ospreys and gray whales with the scientists and get into their research. And that didn't happen as much this time. And I don't know, I don't think that necessarily has to do with the fact that we were working with larger arts partners or not, or getting more support. That's one thing that I missed on this one. And then, because it was more urban, we were staying in hotels and stuff, and that was, really lovely at a certain level, but it took us away from that original idea of sort of being more in sync with the animals.
Because when you're camping, you're with the elements, as the animals are in a certain way. And that was hard in a more structured tour to make that work.
And just, it made a huge difference not to be on the coast. I don't know, just the presence of the water and the that sort of tides, and there was more opportunity for camping, or it was just designed that way.
When you were here in the Twin Cities, there were really 4 separate public performances. The first being up in Arden Hills at the Army's munitions ex-Superfund dump site, which is now quite a remarkable kind of emerging nature preserve, where there's still National Guard training going on and things. And we had maybe close to a couple hundred people watching the company perform that we had to bus in because it's not open to the public. Tell us now, a few weeks later, what's your sense of that particular performance or that experience?
I think that performance was the highlight of the entire tour for me. It brought together so many different elements that I'm hoping to bring together. The fact that it was a Superfund site, that it was this wounded land that has a whole rebirth, and it's becoming a vital area that will gain more and more biodiversity. And as the naturalists there mentioned, they have these trumpeter swans are nesting there for the first time in 80 years. And I read an article in Audubon magazine about these endangered butterflies that are coming back. So that at that level, in that setting, to be able to bring people to a site that they hadn't necessarily known about or didn't have access to was really exciting. The weather was so perfect. We had a day there earlier in the week and then several hours there before the performance, so I felt like Reed kind of really pooled and sunk into the energy there. Something about the space and the nature of the event I felt was really welcoming to our audience, and they just took off. The kids and the audience are running all over the place. That was so beautiful to see this land kind of reclaimed.
Repopulated. And
under the auspices of an art event. Which was, and I felt like it brought out some of our best dancing and connections to the environment. The audience moved around us in a way they hadn't before. And then it could be wrapped up with this panel where the actual issues and politics of what's going to happen to that land could be discussed in a forum of people who are both artists and environmentalists. I think that was probably our most mixed audience in terms of people who were familiar with the arts and people familiar with the environment. That was really great for me. There was all different ages. And people just seemed to be enjoying themselves so much. And the sun was setting as we left. It was just really a highlight.
It's very, very, very memorable. And the notion of using an art experience to spark civic dialogue, something that we're exploring a great deal as we open the new Walker. Has that always been an important part of your work? And what do you say to people who say, well, art should be able to stand, on its own as art for its own sake and not need to, become a spark for broader societal issues? Where do you put yourself in that conversation?
Well, I think it's a huge continuum, and I believe really strongly in the diversity of all kinds of artistic forms and dialogues. And I think one of the reasons I can do a project like this is that I feel like my work is extremely experimental. And that's actually been a huge issue that I've talked to the dancers and our partners about. How much do you tell the audience about what they're about to see? Because I think I'm introducing people to experimental dance for the first time and they're really confused. And I don't want people to feel like, oh, that's elitist, I don't understand it, I'm never going to understand it. I want to let them in, but I also don't want to frame too strongly how they're watching it. I want to, because I'm actually kind of resistant to language in the realm of dance. I really feel like dance is a very powerful form, it has its own language, it speaks for itself, and too much language kind of reduces that magical, kind of ethereal, ephemeral impact that dance has. And the whole point of this project is to re-engage people in their kinetic imagination through this experience that's outdoors, and the workshops key people into their sensory perceptions in a way they might not do normally. And so my hope is that there is this kind of exchange of getting people to think and experience the world kinetically and imaginatively through our dancing. And I'm constantly trying to evaluate what works best in terms of how much information we give them, getting feedback from the teachers with the kids. Like the kids were like, oh, that's not dance. Like how much of discussion do you have?
Right.
And is it enough just to bring up all the questions? Like, do you have to give more foundation and meat to it? Which I feel like I really tried to do with the educational component and with the panels.
Right.
Although the panels often tend to go towards the science and not to the dance, but that was
Right.
great about these panels here. They really incorporated that.
Well, you're not alone in trying to sort through those issues of how much is too much information and how didactic does one want to become in sort of framing an art experience of especially experimental work, because we struggle with that all the time. Do you find that, did you think that that you hit a balance that you're going to use for part 4, and maybe you could talk about the next step of Bird Brain project, what's your next species that you're going to tackle on, and maybe some of the things you've learned from this experience?
I feel like I'm really in the process of trying to figure out. I feel like I made some choices to frame the dancing and make it a little more accessible, and I think that was really valuable, and I learned a lot from that.
Can you explain frame the dancing?
My work within this project has primarily been improvisational, and I haven't worked with that much choreographic movement because we're in all these different sites, and often in the other tours we were arriving for the first time, and part of the performance was us navigating and negotiating this new terrain just the way a bird would, or
sure. But would there be certain phrases that you would pull from?
No, really. They were just like a process of working from vision or sight or sound, or working with concepts of arriving and departing, or building a location in a place that you'd arrived, and pretty abstract concepts.
And would you have signal mechanisms between the dancers and ways to, were they basic improvisation approaches that all your dancers were familiar with and knew how to respond to one another in terms of the movement?
Yeah. There would be some structure based on numbers of people or locations within it that people would move through, and we worked on these processes enough to sort of feel comfortable moving through those. But in this one, we worked with some very simple set material that I think allowed the audience to get some comfort.
Right.
Because one thing I realize, even now, I'm full of questions about the work, but what does it mean to put a human in the landscape?
Right.
Working from these very organic and perceptual and sensorial experiences. In the studio, that works really well. In the studios where I can be like wild and organic and subtle and very sensorial, and it's in the contrast of being within this kind of hermetic, controlled environment. But putting that out here, I feel like it kind of disappears.
Right.
Because it's like a white on white or something.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm really confused about what to. I mean, I almost think it'd be more appropriate to dress up like a drag queen with feathers and high heels, like Ann Carlson's bird piece.
And be something different in the outside. Yeah.
And ironically be more ironic in sort of what that would mean. But I really love the way that dancing environment has changed me, or my relationship to dancing that way.
Right.
So in this one, I really tried to create some way of hanging, something that the audience could hang on to. Like they're doing something in unison, they're repeating the same thing. Yeah.
For the whole Ducks and Geese tour.
Yeah. But it got more and more so. And then we were really working on the transition between when we were doing choreographed work and improvised work.
Right.
And I still feel like I'm not completely satisfied with that. And I want to figure out more about that. But it was I learned a lot from this. So as I move forward, I'm going to move back into the theater for a year.
For a while,
yeah.
Right. And make some fully choreographed works that you...
Now I really want to make something fully choreographed.
Because in the past, your work has been a combination of structured choreography and improvisation, has it not?
Yeah.
And so is it because you've been in such wide open spaces and wild natural settings that you're interested in doing a more specifically designed...
I think so. I really want to rein it in. I feel like I've just been so open and dispersed, and I want to pull it in and build my own microsystem. Like really try and build my own sustainable system, working with a set designer who builds swamps and a sound designer who works with tiny transmitters. So my idea is that we'd build a sort of micro ecosystem that the dancers would respond to it first. And maybe that would be more improvisational, or so there'd be a give and take between the environment and the dancers, and then these translators would start triggering, and then the dancers would influence the environment. So we'd have an impact on the environment that we were in.
Right.
So we'll see. How that, and I want to kind of, the whole series of tours has led first to very basic kind of navigational and sensorial and perceptual ideas, to more of these ideas of arriving and departing and location and transitions between things, and then the flocking sort of ideas of what it means to flock and be completely in tune with the people that you're working with on different levels, different ideas about unison. And
do you, and then after your year of being back in the theater, are you still interested in doing a fourth?
Yes, I'm really interested. The fourth tour will follow northern wheat ears from the Arctic. I'm going to start with the population in Labrador.
What are those?
They're small, nondescript shorebirds. They're like about this big. They're brown.
They're along the west coast?
They actually go from the Arctic down through northern Europe to West Africa, and then down Siberia to East Africa, and they're very rarely seen in this continent. They're basically an European and African bird.
Do you have art partners that you can work with along there?
No. I've began to put out some feelers and sort of like try and, but I think it will take several years to gather up the resources to do something like that. But I'm really curious to see what it would be like to do something like this in Europe. And work with schools and work with scientists.
And then to go through West Africa and East Africa, it would be remarkable range of experiences.
I did a tiny version of it in Prague last fall.
Did you? Yeah.
And that was really fun. I worked in this old brick factory and a quarry, and we performed indoors and outdoors, and hooked up with some really interesting artists. And there's tracking storks that actually go to North Africa. So I got, the language barrier was a little bit difficult, but I
realized we sort of skipped over just a few of the other components that happened here in the Twin Cities. You did work with 4 schools, 2 in St. Paul and 2 in Minneapolis. How was that process? What did you find in working with the kids? And maybe describe those performances that you did, that the company did with the kids, how they were different than the ones just the company did.
Well, I started last year, a little bit.
It was an all-year education process, right?
And I designed this educational resource guide with Suzanne Rotelli from the Walker and Jane Greenberg from the Bell Natural History Museum. And we put together 6 activities that would kind of integrate the study of navigation and migration and birds with movement. So that was really fun to design that and think about what that would be and all the different resources. And Jane and Susan were incredibly helpful. And then in September, I met all the schools and did the introductory kind of navigation workshop. And then we had designed that once a month the teachers would do one more activity, and they would bring in a specialist. So they had someone who took them on a field trip to the Carlos Avery Wildlife Refuge, and they had someone who came in and talked about landscape and space and mapping.
These were volunteers from Audubon or elsewhere?
The Minnesota Ornithological Society, someone from the Bell. So they had a pretty integrated experience. And then we came in April, or the end of April and early May, and we had one rehearsal with each one of them, and then they came and performed either at the Walker or at the Bell. And I just got an evaluation from one teacher, and I think in some cases I'm doing so much that I kind of overlook the importance of really introducing people to dance.
Right.
So she talked about how the kids didn't really even know what dance was, and they didn't think this was dance, and it would have been helpful for them to see us perform or see videotapes, so they had a little bit more of a context. Because I was so excited about, introducing the scientific information, I sort of forgot about the artistic, because that's what I am. I don't think about it. I feel like everybody knows what it means to be an artist. So I would do that differently.
Right.
And I think the kids that did get to see us perform really got a lot out of it, and it made more sense to them.
Like the day at the Bell Museum, a lot of them stayed and watched the company perform.
And the teacher afterwards said that was really important for them. I mean, they gave them a whole new context for looking at dance. But there's a very simple dance that we teach them. We can teach it in about 45 minutes, and it's a little bit literal in terms of the flocking, and they're really working with unison, but it's very energetic. I thought it up when I was driving back to New York on one of my residency events. It was right when we were going to war, and so I just wanted to see lots and lots of people doing something really repetitive and quiet and powerful, just as a response to the fact that we were invading Iraq. And I've been thinking a lot about flocking. And so I made it, I thought about it in the car, and then we've been doing it ever since. And I feel like it really has, reminds me a little bit of Anna Halpern's dances. I've done one or two of hers, but it sort of has, I love doing it now, teaching it.
And the kids seem to really be enjoying it too, at least when I saw them at the Bell Museum.
At first they were a little self-conscious, but especially the kids at Bell seem to really get into it. And they wear these little newspaper feathers, and the one funny story I have about that is the Waldorf school.
Yeah.
The only kids where we put them on and they immediately started reading
the papers. And the Waldorf kids aren't, supposed to be so literal-minded necessarily. How do you feel about, a lot of, maybe not so much in the first two tours, and this is back a little bit to another question I had for you, but a lot of people nationally have really been impressed by the project, and I know one of the things that gravitated my interest toward the project was both the intellectually curious nature that you proceed with your work, that you're investigating all these different subject matters, and you're immersing yourself in the natural surroundings, and you're integrating a lot of discussion and a lot of other parts of what it is to be human in the world today into the investigation of your work. How do you feel about your role, perhaps, now just winning a Guggenheim and things like that, and this project as being something of a model for others to look at? You're very open about things that you felt didn't work as well as you'd hoped they might, but in many ways I think the Bird Brain Initiative is being looked at as another kind of model that people can look to as to how dance might be integrated in a unique way to those that maybe don't regularly experience dance, and how pressing issues in our society can be looked at through a different kind of lens that may allow a different kind of discussion. Are you uncomfortable with being creating something that others look to as a kind of groundbreaking initiative?
Well, it's very exciting to me that the work is perceived that way, and I really hope that it fulfills some of those goals you were talking about. I do think in some ways it is unprecedented in some way, and talking about sustainability, I think in this particular moment it's incredibly difficult for artists to sustain themselves, and if this project can be used as an example of ways of reaching out and making art more sustainable and meaningful on a broader level to a larger audiences, and that there's an exchange back and forth between that would be thrilling to me. And I really hope that these different communities realize the importance of that kind of interconnection and exchange, because I think it is kind of vital to our survival. And it's been hard work as artists and environmentalists. Both artists and environmentalists have a lot in common. I've always, when I meet these organizations, they're underfunded,
understaffed,
overworked, super passionate, super committed.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to learn from each other. And so, of course, I believe that art is an incredibly powerful form, and it's the thing that makes art survive is diversity, and the thing that makes an environment survive is diversity. And I think we still have a lot to learn from these systems around us. And one thing about that New York Times Magazine is there's this incredible forward-looking design of Manhattan.
Oh, really?
And it goes from being like, they have this little map from 1640 or whenever to 2050. And it turns into this ecological utopia, this something or other, bio-utopia or something. And I even in this really drastic time of, when things look really grim, I'm trying to reach out towards these more hopeful, and of course, it's possibilities, and art is central to that, as the art walker proves,
And you've said that you've despite the horrible challenges that the planet seems to be facing, and I think so many artists, like the Walker's Art and Environmentalism series with Robin Holcomb's work and Terry O'Connor's work, and now Emily Johnson doing a piece about global warming in October that we've helped commission, I think in part is a response to artists feeling like they want to have their work look at these issues in some way. But you've said something that has given me hope in some ways, is that you said that when you're in urban settings and right when the project began, that the force of nature's ability to sort of survive and come back in these in places that you'd think it would never reemerge, Superfund sites and others, there's really given you a hope that the planet can heal itself in some ways. And any last thoughts that you have about bird brain in general, or your experience with the walker, or now a couple weeks after it's over, what you take away from this last chapter in Bird Brain most strongly?
I think what I take most strongly and is the hardest to document is those connections that you make with people. You come through town, you're here for 4 or 5 days, and I feel like I've been so impressed, or that I'm like physically have the impression on me and the intellectual dialogue that I've had with people of not only the sites where we've danced, but those kind of really energetic connections you make where you're like, yeah, that's a great idea, or that's such good information.
What a great conversation after that performance, or whatever,
And I just, it's like dancing. It's ephemeral, it's there and then it's gone, but then it plays somehow in the cellular makeup of your being and your relationship to the world. And that I think that migratory birds make that connection, that they're energetically connecting all these little ecosystems and environments from continent to continent. Just sort of, with this project, I've been trying to do that as well. And it happens on, the very personal level. Like I just have so many memories of taping the newspaper around all these different kinds of wrists. And
the kids' wrists.
Yes.
And,
and dancing for and talking to different people in the audience and all that stuff. And it's so fleeting, but it's the strongest thing that I have at some point, at some level. It means more to me than the videos or the...
That mental memory, the physical memory of all that.
And that gives me hope too. There's a lot of amazing people out there
doing things that are sort of under the radar. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for all your great work.